All right, Alex, how are you? Here we are. We just did a little pre-chat, but I'm really glad to have you on the podcast and on our live stream, and am just so excited to dig into all of your amazing knowledge because we all know that it's there. So, how are you? And what's your story? I guess we'll start with.
For how am I? I'm doing pretty okay. 2021, all things considered. Um, my story. So I guess that well, I won't go all the way back to my childhood in Massachusetts, but I'll go to my start in education and trauma informed education. I started out teaching kind of accidentally. I was looking for a job and I ended up working at this little school in Vermont called Centerpoint, and it's a small therapeutic alternative school. And so I sort of got into trauma informed education accidentally because that was just my normal when I started working. And so I was there for many years, first as a teacher and then as sort of like a teacher leader hybrid. Um, and so my everyday was, our little school was kind of designed around trauma informed practice before that was really a thing, because those were the needs of the students that we were working with. And so then I eventually started, networking more, going to conferences, and realizing that not everyone had any idea what I was talking about when I mentioned things about trauma. Um, and so I got really interested in figuring out how can we take what's working in our little school and in sort of these pockets all over and bring it to teachers who also have students who need a trauma informed environment. And so for the past few years, I've been wearing many hats, but all around that goal. And so I do some consulting, I do some teaching of teachers, I do workshops, and I've been writing. And so all around that goal of bringing trauma informed practices to the people.
And as somebody who has partnered with you, and you've spoken to my school, and you've worked with my teachers, they always left inspired, and they always left ready to take on this challenge of meeting kids where they are. And I think it's powerful, and I connect to that, like, well, I just started doing the work because it was the work we did. And I think that's powerful in itself, that you were in an environment that you walked into that was already moving, and then you expanded the vision of what trauma informed education is. And so equity centered, is it equity? Is that right? But it
Yes.
came out, but I was gonna say it came out naturally, but it didn't say equity centered trauma informed education. So talk about what that, like, that's a lot, right? Talk about what that means. And of course, that's your book title. So if for people who need to pre-order that, get that order in. But what does it mean? What
Uh,
does it mean?
great question. It is kind of a mouthful, but hopefully it's going to roll off the tongue soon. So, equity centered trauma informed education. I'm kind of allergic to acronyms, and so I didn't want to make some kind of cutesy acronym there. Um, but this is the book I just finished writing. It's coming out this spring in May, and you can, like you said, you can pre-order it. And it's part of a series at Norton that is edited by Paul Gorski, who some folks might be familiar with, who's a big champion of equity in schools. And the series, it's called the Equity and Justice in Education series. And it's really taking a lot of different elements of education and sort of really looking at them through that equity lens. And so this lined up perfectly with my interest, because one of the things that, in these years that I've been looking to uh, expand people's understanding of trauma informed education, there's a lot of people out there talking about trauma informed education. And one of the things I say in the book is that no one owns trauma informed education. It's not a program, it's not out of one particular organization or anything. And so the plus side of that is that anyone can do it, and there's nothing you need to buy and there's nobody you need to pay. But the minus of that is that not everyone is really talking about the same thing when they talk about trauma informed education. And unfortunately, I started to sort of notice and interact with some folks who, when they're talking about trauma informed education, when I'm talking about trauma informed education, I'm looking at transforming the way that we do school, so that we're decreasing the impact of trauma, we're helping prevent trauma. It's sort of a transformative approach. Some people, when they're talking about trauma informed education, tend to talk about it in this way of, well, I just want some way to get those rascally kids with hard stuff going on to behave better in my classroom. And it's unfortunate because it's too narrow, and um, it's not very strengths based for those kids. And also kind of puts a label on, so there's all kinds of challenges. So for me, centering equity in trauma informed work, and centering trauma informed work and equity, sort of melding them together, is where we need to go. It's not two separate things and you're doing two different initiatives. It's all part of the transformation of schools that we need.
And I know that we've shared conversations a long time ago about this, well before probably many conversations were being had. And I think it's spot on, right? You can't talk about trauma informed education without talking about equity. It just it can't happen, right? And you can't have trauma informed education without these pieces. So when you propose the new definition of trauma informed education, I want to read it really quick because it's really powerful. And it's: trauma informed educational practices respond to the impacts of trauma on the entire school community and prevent future trauma from occurring. Equity and social justice are key concerns of trauma informed educators as we make changes in our individual practice in classrooms, in schools, and in district wide and statewide systems. How powerful is that? And so let's talk about that. You kind of went to the classroom level and went all the way out to look at the statewide level. Why do you feel that is so important when you're talking equity and trauma informed education?
I mean, it's really, and something you and I have talked about is how all those layers have to work together, and that a trauma informed teacher uh, is only going to be able to do what she can do within what her school leader is providing. Right? What are the supports and systems that are backing up her work in the individual classroom? And then that trauma informed school leader, as you well know, is sometimes really supported and sometimes really limited by what their district is doing. And I have talked to countless teachers and also countless school leaders who are really trying to make change in their classroom or in their school, but then in comes this policy where they are really, they run up against it, and they have to then decide, do I try to protect my job or do I make some trouble here and go against this policy that I know isn't right? One example is that, in a trauma informed environment, uh, we don't punish, right? And we really look at any policies that are punishing or really harsh and try to change them. And so, one policy like that would be attendance. And so, a trauma informed teacher might be much more lenient in her classroom and not really, take points off or give students a hard time if they're absent, and might find flexible ways to make sure they're not falling behind because of that. But if she's got a really harsh school policy and her principal's breathing down her back, she's limited in that. And then on that same going up in the systems, right? If as a school you're saying, you know what, we're going to do all these really great flexible ways to reach out to families, all this kind of stuff, but then you have a state truancy policy, where you're supposed to be referring truant kids to the police, then you're really limited in that too. So it is going to take a full system change. And what I say in the book is that uh, I know that that's a lot. I know that's a lot, and it can feel really overwhelming. And so, what I tell people is, anywhere that you can start is where you should start. We don't have to do all of it at once, but my hope is that if if a lot of people are doing something at once, then together we make a pretty big impact.
And that part in your book is start where you are. I mean, that's
Mhm.
exactly what it is. And I think that's powerful in itself because people, I always use this as a context. Guided reading when I was in the classroom was like this mysterious thing that people thought it was just, and no, really, you just sit in front of kids and let them read, right? I think trauma-informed education is becoming this mysterious thing that everybody thinks there has to be something, right? No, it's more about your lens. It's how you see things. It's how you operate. It's not something you do, it's who you are. And in your book, you really talk about those structural lenses that
Mhm.
people and organizations need. Talk about that section and how important structural lenses are when you're talking about systematic change.
Yeah. So a structural lens is really the idea that, sometimes in schools we look a lot at individual students, and if individual students are struggling, then we look at how do I fix the individual kid. And that really is ultimately a deficit view that there's something wrong with the kid and that the fix is with that individual kid. So if you shift instead to a structural view, what you're looking at are what are the systems, structures, policies, forces, all those things that might be contributing. So, again, if we look at attendance, just because I'm going on that example tonight, um, if you look just from an individual lens, you're going to say, well, why isn't that kid coming to school? Or you might even say, why isn't that kid's parent getting them to come to school? If you look instead at a structural lens, you look at what are the systems that are getting in the way. So, one thing you might look at is that there's not a guaranteed livable wage. And so the kid's parent is working two jobs with unpredictable shifts. And so it's hard for the parent to consistently help the kid get up in the morning. That's a structural problem that's impacting the individual. Another problem you might look at is, accessible public transportation. You might look at even things like nutrition and sleep, and what are the ways that that there are barriers to those things that they're impacting the individual, but the cause of that kid's problem getting to school is not entirely that the kid doesn't want to get to school or can't, right? There's so many systems at play. And so again, as an individual teacher, you might be going, well, I personally cannot change the minimum wage in my state all by myself. And that doesn't help this kid get to class on time tomorrow. So, again, right, you're not taking on everything by yourself. But part of it is when you hold that structural lens in your mind, it helps you hold an asset based view, a strengths based view of the kid, and recognize that the solutions are not going to be, oh, just try harder, oh, just care more. You have to take it all together.
I mean, so powerful, and I think it's the key, and I think once you do step back and you see that systems lens, and I've said many times we're not fixing broken kids, we're actually fixing broken systems, because there are so many, and it's just. I mean, I was just talking this morning to someone at my school about things that we need to adjust, and it isn't that things like my school needs to adjust. I'm talking big picture. And it's so, so true. And when you are able to step in that space of a bigger picture, you can kind of see where there's opportunity. I always refer to myself as insanely optimistic. There's opportunity out there to support kids, whether it's with policy or becoming, I don't want to say against it, but I would say, let's just say disruptors, right? We're
Yeah.
disruptors. Disruptors unite. That's what we do. So you can't be afraid to disrupt a system that's broken for kids and benefiting kids for sure. So you get into several principles in your book about equity centered trauma informed education. I think there's six. Is that right? Yes, six.
Yeah.
Talk through, and you don't have to go far, but talk through those principles because I think that will give listeners and people who are live right now an idea of kind of some of the meat of what your what you've developed in this book.
Yeah. So the six principles of equity-centered trauma-informed education. So this is really the idea that we're blending those two approaches together. And so these six principles would describe sort of what is education like when we're equity centered and trauma informed. So the first is that we're anti-racist and anti-oppression, because racism and oppression cause trauma and they cause inequity. And so we have to commit to being against those things, right? Pretty simple. The second is asset based, which we were just talking about. So, really working from a place of looking at students' strengths and also the strengths of their families, the strengths of the community, the strengths of educators and leaders. And also, things like traditional healing practices and traditional ways of resistance, and just really how many beautiful assets we have, and working from that, as opposed to a place where we are labeling, blaming, trying to fix people. The third is systems oriented. So we talked about that too, but the idea that we're really looking to shift those systems in addition to the work we're doing with individual people. The fourth is maybe my favorite to talk about, which is human centered, um, which is really about the idea that our school system and our education system can really be kind of dehumanizing. I mean, one example I talk about a couple times in the book is just all of the rules and regulations about going to the bathroom at school, both for students and teachers. And I talk about this idea that teachers sometimes joke like about the fact that you can't go to the bathroom for hours at school, but I really find that just about the least funny thing in the universe, because if we want to work against trauma, trauma is dehumanizing, and so we have to be human centered to work against it, to foster the full humanity of everyone in the school community. And at a really basic level, right, that means you can get your needs met. So of course there's many other elements of being human centered, but starting with those basic needs, and then working for a lot of other ways we can focus on humanity. The fifth is that equity centered trauma informed education is universal and proactive. So, the idea that we're not picking some kids and saying, this kid needs trauma informed, this kid doesn't, this kid needs equity, this kid doesn't, right? But instead, looking if we're making a transformation, then we're doing it universally and we're doing it proactively. And then finally, the sixth principle is social justice focused. So this is the big pie in the sky goal that if we are successful in our equity centered trauma informed practice, then trauma ceases to exist. And I know that that's like really big, but I think we have to dream a little bit about what we're working towards, right? And so the goal truly is to work towards social justice, to work toward a better world. And that really is part of our work as educators when we work with our kids, right? When we're actually doing the work of teaching. I think a lot of teachers are motivated by that, right? About helping shape a better future through the academic work that we're doing with the kids. And so that is part of it as well.
And the dehumanizing piece just really, it just swirls around in my mind, because it's not just dehumanizing students. And that, we know that took a major dip when we started standardized assessing. Kids became data points and they lost their identity on a bigger scale when you're talking districts and things. But when it comes to teachers, I heard what you just described of working with kids and supporting kids academically. As an administrator, I feel like that is the same reciprocal cycle that I have to do for my not my teachers, for teachers I work with, right? Because my role is that same role of making sure basic needs are met, assuring that they have everything they need to be successful. Let them, when they're having escalations, or when they're having trouble at home, or there's emergency, just like it happened today, go, leave, I've got it, go. Right. And I think we've lost that too, in this whole shift of education around teachers don't work hard enough, teachers don't do this, teachers don't do
Mhm.
that. And it's painful, because I see how hard educators work on a day to day.
Mhm.
So you also get into 4 shifts we need to make. So you covered the principles, and one of these shifts, whoo, when I read it, it just like it lit me on fire in a good way. And so talk about some of the major shifts that you feel need to happen and that you covered in your book, because at the end of the day, you are right. Shift has to happen, right? It
Mhm.
has to happen. We know we're operating under archaic, non humanized, not human centered policies. So, what are some of the shifts that you addressed in your book?
So, all these shifts are really about recognizing that we're not at those 6 principles I described yet, and that it's going to take some work to get there. And the shifts that I talk about in part are looking at, what a little bit of what's the common narrative around trauma informed education right now, and how can we put it on the track towards that equity centered trauma informed practice. So, one of them, for example, is shifting to that universal and proactive stance. So, going from being reactive or looking at trauma informed just as a behavioral intervention, instead to looking at how do we infuse trauma informed practice into every day. Um, Another of the shifts that I think is the one that you're really excited about is shifting away from a savior mentality, instead to this idea of an asset based view or unconditional positive regard. And so that idea is really around some themes that I and others have seen come up in the trauma informed world, that that there's this little bit of a thread of, oh, those poor trauma kids, and we just really need to help them. And something that I am really inspired by is, there's a researcher, professor, author named Dr. Elizabeth Dutro. I highly recommend checking out her book. Is called The Vulnerable Heart of Literacy. And something that she writes about in connection to trauma informed education is that we have to break down this idea that there is such a distinction as a person in need of healing and a person who gives the healing, because that's not really the way that things work, right? We are all people who may potentially experience trauma, and we are also all people with the capacity to help others heal and support one another. And that includes students, right? They have that capacity. And so we need to really break down this idea that teachers or counselors, or really anyone who works at a school, is saving kids, fixing kids, pulling them out of, misery and into a better light. Like, yes, we want to help and support kids, but we want to do it in a way that builds off of their own internal resources and the strength of communities, as opposed to in this way where um, we're trying to save somebody.
And I know you've only gotten to 2, but I think what you described is true resilience. It's building their capacity for resiliency. And I
Mhm.
think, and I told you before, in the South, we call what you describe as bless their little heart. And
Yeah.
and we bless a lot of little hearts here in Tennessee. And it's like, no, 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 no. We're not saving kids. And in my school, we say we're trying to find the innate genius that every kid possesses. And every kid has amazing gifts and abilities.
Mhm.
Yes, some of them have experienced things, but they still have amazing gifts and abilities. And seeing kids in that way helps not become the savior mentality of I'm here to save you. No, I'm here for you to realize how awesome and amazing you are. And then
Mhm.
through that relationship, building their capacity for resilience. And I think
Mhm.
that's so important, because I think in the continuum of moving through of trauma informed education and equity centered education, right? It's really about a continuum. I think at some point we all got into education to help kids, right? And then it
Mhm.
kind of manifested. Wait a minute, no, 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 no. It's bigger than us, and I love that you addressed that because it's so important. So, what about shift number 3?
So that one's so relevant to you, because that one is all about leadership and systems. So this is really looking at the shift from seeing trauma informed as something that is kind of only in the teacher's job, to seeing how it affects the whole school. And I will say, like most resources on trauma informed education do look at, whole school strategies and things like that. And yet, a lot of times, the professional development that schools bring in is for the teachers and not for the principal. And so in that section of the book, I address it directly to school leaders, to talk to them directly about what you might want to do and what you might want to work on. And so in that section, we're looking at things like, don't put self care all on teachers, because part of your job as the school leader is to create community care. Something else in that section is looking at the school leader helping focus and be a lead learner in the professional development, and also really, uh, you know, focus all professional development through an equity centered, trauma informed lens, even if the professional development is like about math or about reading strategies. And that idea that you're infusing your whole school with that lens, rather than piling initiatives on top of teachers until they can't dig their way out of it. And so those things, along with shifting school policy, are really part of that shift, so that trauma informed becomes equity centered trauma informed practice becomes how we do school, not something that we do at school.
I love that. And again, going back to the reflective lens of as an administrator, this isn't about teachers fixing kids, and it's not about administrators fixing teachers to fix kids. It's not. It's that reciprocal support of I support the teachers, they support me. It's that given and understanding wellness is a true thing we all have to take very, very seriously. And I love that you hit that as one of your shifts, because we make that shift. For some reason, there's this badge of honor for martyrs in education who work themselves until 9 o'clock at night. That's not okay. And I tell my teachers, like, y'all, I'm pulling out of this parking lot at the latest 5 o'clock. And if you're in here, I'm going to call you with a loudspeaker and say, you got to go, because we've got to value that. We've got to value our self-care and those things in our families and such. So what about number 4?
So that one is about shifting from, a lot of trauma informed texts, when they talk about academic learning, what they're talking about is how trauma impacts students and how then students will struggle in their academics, which is true. If you're impacted by trauma, it can be hard to, for example, you might have challenges with executive functioning, memory, concentration, things like that. Um, but what I want to look at is not just looking at that direction, right? How trauma impacts the classroom, but I want to look at how the classroom and academics can impact the existence of trauma. So this is really looking at that principle about social justice and making a trauma-free world, because we have such great opportunity in our classrooms to help students develop critical lenses, to help them become advocates, to help them engage in work that really matters, right? In things that change their communities for the better, that strengthen their communities. And so, really looking at part of trauma informed, equity centered practice being focusing on those types of educational experiences for kids, so they are experiencing, healing practices through that social justice education.
And I mean, as I told you before we get on here, there's just so much. And I haven't even been able to read the whole book. I just got a little taste. There's just so much in it that makes me as an administrator go, man, this is not only motivating, but inspiring. And it's like actionable. I can go back tomorrow and start planning, within the culture of my school. How do we do this? And I think one of the big pieces, and you kind of mentioned it, but I think we need to dig deeper, and it's that fostering professional growth, right? And one of the pieces that was in there was, I've got to look up exactly how you worded it, but it was about basically doing it. Like, if you're an administrator, being the example that you want to see, model your own learning. That talk more through that, because I think, how it is, Alex, when you get a professional development, like maybe 3 hours later, you may remember one thing. Like, Talk about how important this is, because I know how important it was for my school as
Mhm.
we transitioned to being a trauma informed school. Talk a little bit about it.
Mhm. I mean, it's just all too common. And I want to say that, I was a school leader, teacher hybrid for a while. I know that there's a lot on the plate. Part of my work is supporting school leaders. So I'm not saying this to rip on school leaders, but pretty often, when there's professional development about trauma informed practice, maybe the principal's in the room, maybe the principal's not in the room. When there's PD about equity, maybe, we're going to talk about what this actually looks like at our school, or maybe we're going to all keep it pretty vague because we're worried about if we actually name the equity problems. Is my admin going to get mad at me because I actually mentioned that we have a problem here? And so there's really to make these shifts stick, the school leaders need to be the lead learners, right? They need to show that I'm as dedicated to this as I want all my teachers to be, and to model that learning. So, I talk about things like, tell teachers what you're learning and what you're working on. Tell teachers what shifts you have made, based on that learning, right? So not just, oh, I'm reading this book or I went to this workshop, but here's what I want to change at our school because of this learning. Be vulnerable, for understanding when you mess up, and be accountable to your teachers and recognize that, if you want to model and foster an environment where feedback is welcome, that has to start with you being open to feedback from your teachers, because your teachers, if you let them, will tell you about the equity problems in your school, if you're willing to hear them and do something about it.
And so powerful. And it's so interesting you said that, because we just had a faculty meeting last week and these conversations came up. And we started really digging deep, and we had some teachers at the end say, thank you all for being willing to even have these conversations. But I also think my poor staff, not only do I sit in the PDs, sometimes I get all fired up and like, my poor staff, they just have to deal with me because again, this isn't something that we do. It's who we are. It's how we operate. And I did appreciate the little shout out in the book. And I think that the role, and I didn't see it at first when I became an administrator and we started this, but I see the impactful role of an administrator, advocating for this for the school, and giving the space and opportunity for teachers to be able to do the work.
Mhm.
And I didn't see that for a long time, but I certainly do now. What about, because I think this isn't something that we talk about, but you sure did, about leadership and the wellness of leaders and how we manage ourselves and how we navigate the world of school administration. Because I'm going to be honest, I thought I had a clue when I was assistant principal. I had no clue the difference between an assistant principal and a principal. Talk
Mhm.
about that, because I don't think that gets enough conversation,
Yeah.
out in the world we live today.
It certainly doesn't. And one reason that I put the conversation about wellness in this section addressed to school leaders is that, I have read so many books about trauma informed practice, and there's always this chapter about self care. And there's some great stuff. And like, I'm not dismissing the need for this. There's some great stuff about mindfulness and routines and all this good stuff. And teachers can't self-care their way out of toxic work environments. They also can't self-care their way into having health benefits. They can't self-care their way out of the incredible stress of, having to sit through an active shooter drill. Um, I was just someone I know, a teacher I know, shared last week that, the day after the riots at the Capitol, he had to sit through an active shooter drill on Zoom. Um, there's no amount of self-care that you could possibly do, to work your way out of that, right? That is horrible, right? That's a pretty bad one-two punch. And so I put all this stuff about wellness in this section, talking to leaders, because leaders need to be responsible for creating conditions where teachers can thrive. And I talk about, you know, it's not just about cutesy wellness, right? Like getting donuts or having a mindfulness workshop. And again, those things can be really nice if you also have time, money, autonomy, and support. Those are the four things I talk about that admin can really focus on teachers having. Um, as the baseline to their wellness. And then connected to that, like you're mentioning, I encourage leaders to take care of themselves and to model to teachers that they're doing that. So when leaders are, like you said, hey, I'm driving away and I'm not answering your email until Monday, right? And then actually following through on that, or sharing with staff about what supports you're getting. So, hey, I'm going through a hard time. Here's what I did to get support. If anybody else wants to use those same types of supports, here's some information about it. Um, and something I didn't get into in the book, but I would love to get into some other time, is that there is, as a leader in a trauma informed environment, one role that you can take on is a little bit of managing the fire hose of information, because something I do talk about is that to be trauma informed, you don't have to know all the details of a specific kid's trauma. And that sometimes in schools, kids, their families, their health professionals, and the school leaders will intentionally make decisions together about what type of information to share with teachers, keeping in mind confidentiality and sort of the dignity of students to get to choose that. But what that sometimes happens for principals, for counselors, is that they have all the information, and holding all of the information about however many kids you have in the school is incredibly hard, is really stressful. I know you know that for sure, and we've talked about
I'm over here. I'm giving you yes. I mean, 100%. And even this week, Alex, I'm not even going to lie. Two major events, one with a previous student and one with a current student. And matter of fact, it shook me to my core. And
Mhm,
and these things happen more often than educate teachers know. It's more often than the public knows. It's more often than people understand.
mhm.
I
And so to manage that, right? Like if you are not taking care of yourself, then all of the ways that that's going to come across to people is going to be really hard. And so modeling that care, and of course it keeps going up, right? We were talking about the layers, and so you need to make that environment for your staff. You also need that from your higher ups, because we all have higher ups. And so, of course, I'm not saying, oh, it's on you to self care your way out of that stress. But it does just really raise that importance of centering that care and slowing down and making sure to feel that, because it's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot to carry.
I've got two things that I want to share, and these are true life stories. And last year, I was in a bad place. I was in a bad place professionally, personally. I just wasn't motivated. I was feeling overwhelmed. And I had a teacher come into my office and say, we need to talk. And she said in her own way, like, what's going on? Because you're being an a-hole. And that's not, I mean, seriously, that's pretty much what she said. And she's like, this isn't you. This isn't who I know. She worked at the school for a long time. And talk about like feedback and mutual accountability. I needed that. And at that moment, I was like, you're right. Like, I am completely overwhelmed. I have allowed this to sink into my school, because the fact is, if I'm overwhelmed, stressed, and I am on my last nerve, that resonates through the whole building. And I can tell you, I have data to prove it, because my culture data at that point was not good at my school.
Mhm,
That was a turnaround point for me. Like, I
mhm,
got to take care of myself. And when you said turn your phone off, you probably know I have a little cabin that doesn't have internet. Our cell phones don't work. I just tell my staff, go into the cabin. And literally I have no capacity to do
mhm,
anything. And it
mhm,
kind of felt weird. And now it feels really, really good. And so
mhm,
it is those things. It's getting yourself
mhm.
grounded to do this work. You have to be grounded. And
And that example with your teacher is a perfect example of the humanization that we're striving for, because in a dehumanized school, you would not be Matthew, you would be Mr. Portel, principal guy, and your teacher would not be someone you're in community with, but would be your, your direct report or whatever. But when you focus on that humanization, you are two humans who are in community with one another and who care about one another and who find a way to show up for each other. And that I want all teachers and all leaders to have that, right? I want them to have that type of school environment. And so many people do not. And so, the as I'm talking about this, I'm like, man, this is a big problem. What are we going to do about this? But really, why I'm doing this work, why I wrote this book, what I hope is that folks can take some steps to work toward this type of environment, because we all deserve it, right? We're all people who deserve to have that type of care in our lives.
And we call it mutual accountability, and it's not mutual accountability in the sense of assessment scores. It's mutual accountability for each other. We are all literally the old High School Musical. We're all in this together, right? Like, but for real. And I go back to thinking about some of the other, when you talk about feedback from staff and really talking about equity. I know one time there was a child who was escalated. He loved, like, I was his person. When he was mad, he was going to get. And I was in the library, and he went to throw a wooden sphere at me, and my lid popped. And it happens, right? It happens for all of us. Wasn't proud of it. The librarian walked up to me and said, "You need to go back to your office right now." Like,
Yeah.
and I went, "You're totally right." And I left, and it was like, I literally thanked her. I'm like, "You saw it. Thank you. I appreciate it, because I wasn't in a good space." That's what school culture should be. There was no judgment.
Mm-hmm.
There was no, and that's talking from a teacher to the principal. And I was so appreciative. And there have been times I look and said, "I think I need you to head back. I got this." And
Mm-hmm.
you can't take offense to it. Really, it's that synergy that has to be in schools. And you're right. We need to, maybe we'll both write a book about this, because this needs to be addressed. So let's get to we don't have a lot of time, and this is a giant section. And I think it's one that we have to continue to talk about, and that's working towards policy changes.
Mm-hmm.
Man, talk about a bear to wrestle. I'll be honest, I changed all of my policies in my school and put it in the handbook, and they never even caught it. So we've totally changed all policies. But yes, what do you think? What is, I mean, where do we
Yeah.
start?
So the example that I give in the book is a case scenario of a student who is going through a hard time at home, and one of the ways that she is coping with it is by using marijuana, right? Coping strategy. She's in high school. It's how she's getting by. Um, so she has a great teacher that's working with her, trying to help her stabilize and get safe at home, trying to make sure that school is working for her. Really, this teacher working her tail off to support this kid. So you have a trauma informed teacher working with this student. Then the student comes to school high, and the school policy says you come to school high for the third time, second time, whatever it is, you're automatically suspended out of school for 5 days. And so all this work of this trauma informed teacher, all the hard work of the student to work with the teacher and try to get on the right track in school, get support. Now, even though we know that home is not feeling good for you right now, you're out of school for 5 days. So that's a situation where the policy needs to change because the policy is trauma uninformed and potentially trauma inducing, right? And there's all kinds of policies like this. There's also policies, folks are talking a lot lately about bathroom policies. And, you might say, well, what do bathroom policies have to do with the trauma informed school? But again, it's that humanization piece. And in particular, we look at the type of barriers for trans kids, for example, to use bathrooms that are safe for them, that are to use the bathrooms that meet their gender. And I've worked with schools who said, well, that's not part of the work we brought you in to talk about. And I said, yes, it is, because uh, uh, kids experience trauma in school when they are harassed, when they can't get their basic needs met safely. And so that's a policy change that needs to happen. to be trauma informed instead of trauma inducing. And there's all kinds of these areas, right? And looking at that blending of equity and trauma informed, there are so many inequitable systems that live in policies. So I give some guidelines in the book about ways to think through your current policies, ways to imagine different policies, and encourage folks to really look at everything, right? So not just the big stuff, but the little stuff too. Even down to your classroom or your dress code. I also give an example in the book of a student group working to revise their dress code in the school. So it can blend right into that piece of students being empowered and students making change because we're all owners of the school. So having that leadership.
And I think it's valid to talk about this is a long journey. Like
Hmm.
these processes, and that's why I said this was such a big section of your book. It's not something that you could just jump right into. It takes work
Hmm.
and it takes being on committees. It takes having conversations. It takes shifting paradigms. And we all know how hard a paradigm is to shift in a lot of ways. But it's digging deeper into these policies that sometimes genuinely don't make sense, right? And
Hmm.
we didn't even get into the disproportionality of exclusionary practices. We didn't even get into, restraint, and we didn't get into any of that stuff. And
Hmm.
those are big issues. We're talking about even just talking about little things that can shift a culture of a school for teachers, students, families, principals, everybody. And I
Hmm.
think that's so, so, so important. And as I thought, this went really, really, really fast, Alex. And when your book comes out, you have to promise to come back so we can really maybe even have a book conversation with some of the listeners and engage them. And I cannot wait to read the whole thing. It's just such powerful work that I know you've been advocating for many, many years. And I love to see it in print and the world to be inside of your amazing mind. So if people want to dig into your amazing mind more, where can they find you on social media so they can see your hilarious kitten posts on Twitter?
Yes, you can follow me on Twitter. It's like an equal mix of deep thoughts about education and then like memes and pictures of cats. So my handle on there is Alex S. Venet. I'm also on Instagram, and I have my website is unconditionallearning.org, where I have a whole trove of blog posts to explore. And you can find links on all of those places for pre-ordering my book.
Looks like Bridget already pre-ordered the book. That's awesome.
That's
Yes, please order the book, you all. This is just it's work that has to be. We have to have conversations about. Get them. Do a book study in your school, in your district. Have these conversations because it's conversations that definitely need to be had. And I'm going to share this quote that was shared at my principal's meeting today with you, Alex, because I think you'll not only appreciate it, but I appreciate it because I work in a district that this is a quote in a conversation that we had today. Equity is neither optional nor negotiable. This is how we are as a school. These are the values to which we will be accountable. Paul Gorski, right? You just
Mhm.
said he was part. And I just think it's so ironic that that was the quote that was given today. And we talked about equity and we talked about bias and we talked about these things. And I want to recognize being fortunate to be in a district that has those because there's a lot of people that do not. So
Mhm.
Alex is also part of our Trauma Informed Educators Network conference planning committee people. So we're so excited to bring this back. Last year we had to cancel it because of COVID and all of the precautions that we just didn't feel it was safe. It will be virtual from July 19th to the 21st. We've got 2 amazing keynotes. We have already have 20 confirmed sessions. We're actually opening up an RFP at the end of next week that will remain open for a couple weeks. Please get those RFPs if you want to present. We are super excited. I'm sure. I know Alex is going to be she's going to be hosting a panel, but I'm sure we can talk her into maybe doing a session too. So if you want to follow me, I'm Principalist on Instagram and Twitter. You can also follow the Trauma Informed Educators Network, which is a group on Facebook and then also a Facebook page. And of course, you've got to follow the podcast. And as I always say, please, please, please wash your hands and wear a mask.
Please.
Yes. So I am pausing the actual audio. All right, Alex, thank you so much. We've got several people still on. And I don't know if you have a minute or two, but if they have a couple questions,
Sure.
I'd love for them to throw it into any of the platforms they're on. But I thank you. And this is such powerful work. I cannot wait to dig into the whole book, because I just got a little taste and it's amazing. So
Well,
anybody,
and it's fun to talk to you about it because you're in it, and so it's always fun to talk to somebody who gets it.
and I just hope we can get more people to get it. And it's so funny you said that, most schools don't want to come and do training for administrators. Next week, I actually am doing a whole training for making a paradigm shift of trauma-informed culture for all principals. And I'm
Oh,
like,
that's awesome.
yes. So we're going to go through the systematic thinking, and I will be talking about equity, and I'll be talking about your book and how they need to get it. So there is one question from MC here, and I think you can see it.
Yes, I see that. So about how do you suggest gently nudging admin to change hurtful policies? So, I mean, it depends on your definition of gently a little bit. um, but I think that so in my book, in the section on policy, I have a list of critical questions that are a way to start um, not necessarily mandating how we should change this policy, but kind of pulling it apart to see what the hidden messages are, what are maybe the unintended impacts, that kind of stuff. And so I encourage, I really just love the use of questioning to dig into that stuff. There's a great strategy called the QFT, or the question formulation technique. If you Google the QFT, then you should be able to find it. It's out of Harvard. And it's a protocol for asking critical questions. And I could see a really powerful PD activity where you come up with some of those questions and then open a conversation. I also think that connecting admin to their values and their goals is helpful. And sometimes, like we talked about before, there's just a lot on everybody's plate. And so I think a role teachers can play a little bit is helping admin prioritize. So coming, especially if you can come with colleagues and say, this is really important to us. This is something we want to work on. You can help your admin say, all right, let's prioritize working on this.
I mean, yes, and that I as somebody who quote unquote gets it, right? I don't know. It would be so difficult. And I have had conversations with admin and in my district as an administrator, and I stood confidently in exactly what we were trying to accomplish at my school, and I could tell them why. And I think that's so important, why we need to do things. And I did it respectfully, and I did it in a questioning way, like asking different like policies, where did this come from, so on and so forth. And then honestly, and I think actually my chief academic officer, maybe even listening, because I saw he liked it on Twitter. I didn't actually ask for permission when we first started. I just knew this is what ethically needed to be done. And I knew we needed to get results, because that's what matters, is our kids positively being impacted. And I think that's huge. So, and I want to also push something that you said about core values, right? Tapping into core values. If you're an administrator and you don't have core values of your school, and you don't have them outlined, and you can't identify them, that's like step number one. We did that in March. We actually redid all of our core beliefs and values. And that gives a foundation to have difficult conversations in moments where it's like, this isn't what's really in the best interest of this child right now, given whatever the escalation, whatever. It's just really important to have those foundations to stand on. So, well,
Absolutely.
thank you all. Thank you, Alex. Thank you all for who's
you.
here listening. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your help on the conference. I always love your brilliance in developing that. But for all the listeners, thank you for being here. We appreciate it. And stay tuned. Next week, I'll be here with James Moffitt, having a live conversation with him. So Alex, I'll talk to you later. All righty. See ya.